What's up, guys? Remember to find a hidden clue, tell me what it is, and put the timestamp of it in the comments. Also, let's please try to get this to like 50 likes just so I know that you like the stories. Alright. Now, in the 1920s, the debris from city streets and sidewalks were referred to as ash. And this ash, over the course of time, would dampen and dry out basements until the floor of the basements resembled a cross between compost and paper mache. It was in this pile of ashes rotting in the basement that a body would be discovered, and it would be the body of a woman who was missing for 4 months. The story of how she got there is a mysterious and twisted one. Through this story, we will explore the argument with her tenant, plus a web of lies, and of course, murder. Mrs. Alice Arsenault and her husband owned a lodging house in the early 1900s in Boston. And at that time, the city was full of life and bustling residents that gave it a sense of vitality. Plus, many people flooded to this metropolis to work and live. Immigrants and citizens alike most of the time needed a place to stay, and some of them turned to lodging houses, just like the tall brick building owned by Mrs. Arsenault at 517 Columbus Avenue. Paul Daskalakis, or Paul Pappas, is how he was better known, was one of those lodgers, and he arrived at Mrs. Arsenault building in September of 1919. And from that time on, Paul and Alice had a friendly intimacy that was casually observed by her other lodgers, even though Alice wasn't committed to Paul, at least not in the way that he was committed to her, if that makes sense. Alice was a woman of the 1920s, and she felt empowered to express herself. And following throughout her life, she had entertained men once and again, in addition to Paul and her husband. And one of those men was Arthur Pelletier. And he would come to call on her from time to time, and Paul absolutely hated Arthur. I mean, when Paul would see the couple together, all of a sudden he would break into this jealous rage and it would just come over him. And once he walked in, actually, on Alice and Arthur in a room with the door closed, and one can only guess what was happening at that moment. And Paul was just simply enraged, quoted as saying someday he would get mad enough and kill both Alice and Arthur. Then, just a few short months after Paul began renting that room from Alice, the weather turned very cold, and the fall fed into winter, with Christmas Day quickly approaching. It was thought that Paul was expecting a token of Alice's affection as his present, or maybe he hoped to express his undying love during the cheerful holiday season. Perhaps that was the case, or perhaps we will never know. But what we do know is that he witnessed Alice giving a gift, but to someone else. And this would be the tipping point where Paul was overcome with envy and jealousy that Alice would celebrate the holiday with someone else, giving that person a special present and leaving Paul out in the cold, so to speak. So imagine Christmas Day in 1919. It would be the last time anyone remembered seeing Alice alive. And as the holiday festivities kept going on, the lodgers, they began to worry. They kept asking where their landlord was and, who would care for the building, collect the rent, and allow them to have a place to live. Now, on January 7th, a bill of sale would appear with Alice's signature, and the furniture of the lodging house had been sold off for $875. Plus, legal documents also had Alice's signature, and the home was sold for about $800. Now, Paul Pappas knew where Alice was. She had left her husband for good, he said, and she was hiding out in Springfield, Massachusetts until she could officially get a divorce, said Paul. Now, even though this information didn't really add up for the renters, one thing was clear, and that was that they needed to find somewhere to live. And during those times, lodging houses were a dime a dozen. So the house was eventually cleared out, And the newspapers of that time don't make it evident where Alice's husband was during all of this, or why he wasn't concerned with his wife's disappearance. You see, the thought behind why he didn't show any interest or was there for any of this was perhaps because he was entertaining women on the side as well. And with Alice out of the picture, he was free to simply do as he pleased. So Paul no longer had a room in the home either. And just like all the other lodgers, he moved away and eventually settled down in Montreal, Canada. Now, 4 months after Alice's disappearance, a new owner moved into the home. And by this time, it was in a state of despair, especially the basement. And the ashes had not been shoveled all winter. And they were built up in this very thick layer. And in May, ashmen were called in to clean up the mess. And while shoveling the heavy debris into an ash can, they made a startling discovery. There, lying in the damp grit, was nothing other than a body. And it turned out that the remains belonged to none other than Alice Arsenault. Her throat had been slit from ear to ear, and her corpse was covered in multiple stab wounds. Plus, she had also been stripped of her jewelry, including her wedding band. Now, the police began to look into former acquaintances of Alice, including the lodgers. And most were still in that area and recalled seeing their landlord for the last time on Christmas Day, 1919. And they described how the building was quickly cleaned out and then sold. Now, one lodger in particular was especially difficult to track down, and that lodger was none other than Paul Pappas. And in the search, police also discovered that Paul and Alice had a history that extended beyond their friendly intimacy while he was a boarder in her home. The pair actually knew each other for a little over a year when they each lived in Revere, Massachusetts as well. So with the police determined to find this man, they finally caught up with Paul and apprehended him in Montreal in September 1920. And when they questioned him and his wife, police noticed her ring looked eerily similar to the one that Alice's husband had described. But Paul claimed he had absolutely no idea who killed Alice. And the last time he had seen her was Christmas Day when she was in a room with 2 other fellows. Police were like, okay, well, how'd you know she was dead? We didn't tell you that yet. And then Paul detailed how he had moved around the country since then and learned of her death from a newspaper in Akron, Ohio, before finally settling down in Canada. But the ring on Paul's wife's finger belonged to Alice, as did the cash from the sale of the home and the furniture which Paul had. Now, these details made the arrest of Paul somewhat easy, and on June 5th, 1922, Paul Pappas was found guilty of murder in a Boston court. And then, in late June of 1923, he was executed by the electric chair. And the details surrounding the case have been lost over time. But the Lady in Ashes murder captured the public's attention, not only in Boston, but the surrounding states as well. And even though there were many suspicions about Paul's motives, what ultimately drove him to murder was unclear, even though most believe it was seeing Alice with different men throughout the months. Plus, Alice not choosing to spend Christmas with Paul. Now, in addition to all of this, Paul's new wife had no knowledge of his twisted past, proving that almost anyone can have a dark side that you yourself know absolutely nothing about.